أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, the ever merciful, the always merciful. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, my dear brothers and sisters, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us tonight on our journey in exploring the book of the world. Allahumma allimna ma yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima 'allamtana. O Allah, we ask you and pray to you to increase us in knowledge, to teach us what benefits us and to benefit us with what you have taught us. وَزِدْنَا عِلْمًا وَفِقْهًا وَرَشَدًا, and increase us in beneficial knowledge, insight and wisdom. Tonight joining me is Dr. Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist from Vital Mind Psychology, a distinguished member of our community. I would like to welcome him with us tonight. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Saad.
Thank you, Brother Muhammad. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
We look forward to exploring with Dr. Saad in our first section the notion of self-care and self-compassion. In the second participation of the first part, I will introduce the notion of divine mercy. Then we will go for a 5-minute break and return with a new introduction to Dr. Abdul Saad as well, in exploring the notion of generosity and how we can acknowledge and highlight the good of others whilst becoming more immune against cynical attitudes out there. And then I will finish off with the essence of morality as the quintessential message of Islam, inshallah. So without further ado, let us now move to Sheikh Mohamed Dehnavi for the first recitation of the Holy Quran for the first part in tonight's session.
الرحمن الرحيم قل لمن ما في السماوات والأرض قل لله كتب على نفسه الرحمة ليجمعنكم إلى يوم القيامة لا ريب فيه الذين خسروا أنفسهم فهم لا يؤمنون.
Thank you, His Eminence Sheikh Mohamed Dehnavi, for this beautiful recitation of the Holy Quran. Let us embark on this journey together, Dr. Abdul Saad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu alaykum anfusakum la yadurrukum man dhalla idha ihtadaytum. Allah says in the Quran, O you who believe, O you who are in a state of tranquility and serenity, focus on your self-care, take care of yourself, of your souls, and do not be negatively affected or hurt by those who do not follow the right path. Let me introduce to you, Dr. Saad, a very interesting observation in our late modern neoliberal society. There is a very eye-opening discussion around the notion of self-exploitation in today's hyperactive society. And the first thing that comes to my mind in this context is a conceptual artist by the name Jenny Haslow. In the United States, I guess, one of the observers once said the advertising campaigns against the organized exploitation of neoliberalism today can be beautifully understood through Jenny's production in making this critical approach to understanding our society visible to the society through advertising photos and exhibitions. So in one of her advertising logos and photos, she says, "Protect me from what I want." And it's a very telling truism of our day and age. as if she is saying to us that the fact that we experience shame today by not being able to live up to the ideals of an achievement society is making us to a large extent fail to experience self-compassion. The fact that our society today is bombarding us with these high social expectations of living up to the ideals is making us experience an innate sense of inferiority and defect by not being able to reach that benchmark. So my question to you, Dr. Saad, is humans have become projects and no longer subjects. And so what is the notion of self-compassion and what does it entail?
Yes, thank you, Brother Muhammad. And I think if I could just back up a moment and to reinforce what you're saying is that one of the difficulties with self-compassion is that we view ourselves as projects, or we've become commodified or atomized, that essentially modern man, and that includes men and women, essentially have become reduced to machines. And with a machine, what you want is to make it work as efficiently as possible. And we've all, I think, collectively bought into this myth of progress, of continuous improvement. And if you're continuously improving, then you need to be continuously on the move. And if you're continuously in motion, there's no time for reflection. So self-compassion, one of the key ingredients of it is to engage in self-reflection. Because the atomistic, mechanistic, material view of man, and again, that means men and women, I'm using it in the generic sense, means that we're just machines, whereas self-compassion entails, no, we are psycho-spiritual beings, energetic beings, beings imbued with a divine imprint from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one of the components of self-compassion is that we engage in self-reflection, and rather than applying labels to ourselves like successful or failure or not good enough or worthless or lazy, is we adopt an attitude of fundamental curiosity toward the self. And this is what compassionate parents do toward their children. They are curious. They are able to hold the child's mind in their mind. And in a way, self-compassion requires us to take a what we might call a metacognitive view of the self, where we say, well, why am I doing this? Why am I reacting in this way? And not with condemnation, but with curiosity. To say, how can I understand myself? How can I understand why I fear this, or why I crave this, or why I'm driven toward this, or I have an aversion to this? So one fundamental core aspect of the concept of self-compassion is an attitude of gentle and kind curiosity toward the self, rather than condemnation. And of course, if we're going to be compassionate and curious toward ourselves, we also must extend that to humanity. So we can't have self-compassion without common humanity, without a sense that we're really in this together. And I don't mean in some idealistic way, as a cliche, we're in this together, but the 1% aren't really in it together. But I mean, as human beings, we all experience fear. We all fundamentally desire inclusion and love. We all make mistakes. We all are prone to experiencing shame, especially social shame. So compassion and kindness and curiosity toward the self and a sense of common humanity, I would say, are two fundamental ingredients of self-compassion. And they are then ultimately manifest as empathy, which is really what we are wanting, to be empathetic.
And you remind me of Alexis Tocqueville, who once said in his masterpiece Democracy in America,
yes,
he said, self-interest in itself is not bad, but what we need is self-interest well understood.
Right.
And I guess self-compassion, as you presented it nicely,
Yes.
pretty much reinforces this point that we need this sense of enlightened self-reflection.
Yes.
You mentioned curiosity, and I touched based on this briefly in the previous slides, that the word curiosity comes from the Latin cura, which gives us both care and cure.
No.
As if we need to care about our own reservoir of compassion, moral potential, love, in order to find the cure for the social diseases of our society. Which brings me to the second question. What are some of the practical strategies for deepening self-compassion as an everyday habit in our lives?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, broadly, is that there are things that get in the way of self-compassion that can block us from actively utilizing strategies. And I would say, a number of things. One of them certainly would be having a very strong internal critic or inner critic. Or, what I say to my patients is your inner judge, tyrant or terrorist. Now, we don't like the word terrorist anymore after certain events, but that is essentially what the inner critic is. So, practically speaking, if you find yourself manifesting very condemnatory thoughts, rigidity, dogma toward yourself and others in whatever arena, including in faith, this can be a telltale sign that you have internalized, or what therapists might say, introjected a strong inner critic. And a strong inner critic ultimately is an anti-life and anti-spirit force which robs us of our capacity to be in our hearts. So one practical element would be to identify an inner critic which both attacks the self, especially what we call our inner child, and then overwhelms and attacks others. Right? So the inner critic is going to derail real growth and an ability to be compassionate toward ourselves and others. So inner critic work, I think, again, practically, it's making the intention to adopt an attitude of curiosity.
Sure.
Because if I'm not curious, if I'm not taking a what we might call an intentional stance toward myself and others, why do they do that? Why did Brother Muhammad do that? Let's say that you did something that I couldn't readily understand. The shortcut of the critic is to label you, or to say, well, you're no longer safe. Whereas curiosity says, well, why might that have happened? And how can I actually approach you and dialogue with you and say, you know what, Muhammad, I care about you and I care about our friendship, but there's something that happened that I'm having trouble understanding, and I wanted to take this time to discuss it with you. Because unless we do that, what we have in our relationships are this scar tissue that develops, where there are these ruptures and they become calloused and they're never healed, because we never experience what we call interpersonal repair. Clarifying misunderstandings is the foundation of relationships, and not the absence of misunderstandings. So they would be some practical points and some perhaps theoretical points around self-compassion and derailers of self-compassion.
Absolutely, that's a very good point, and it's interesting to observe how the Quran, in its style and in its approach to presenting the stories that contain moral lessons, adopts dialogue as a method in order to enable us to understand the other, even if we disagree, even if we consider the worldview of the other different from ours. But as though the Quran is trying to say to us that you need to open up in order to gain insight into your own self through the other. And that's why I believe one of the psychologists once said, the more insight I gain into myself, the more patient I become with others and the world. Because now you understand that the world should not be a replica of your own personality, your own worldview, your own self.
Absolutely, and this is where understanding various systems and modalities of personality, whether people are introverted or extroverted, or systems like the Myers-Briggs typology, or my personal favorite, the Enneagram. All of these systems and all of these typologies, attachment styles, what they give us is an attitude of psychological curiosity. Now, of course, they can be misused, where they become a way that we diagnose people or say, well, you're this or you're that. But that would be a misuse of these systems. At a higher level, at a spiritual level, it's about illuminating someone's unique humanity and their unique struggles, and where perhaps we've developed these, what we call ego fixations. Where are we fixated? For example, are we fixated on fear and are we seeking guidance? Are we fixated on shame and are we seeking affirmation in our psyche? Are we fixated on the need for acceptance and to be left to our own devices? So models that allow us to understand people beyond a unidimensional frame, because we are not all the same. We are not all carbon copies of one another.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that very much hits home.
Yes.
And which leads me to the final question of our first part for your participation.
Yes.
I believe, Dr. Saad, that in today's society we are wrestling with two raging fires. The first is the fires that result from climate change, which we recently experienced in Australia,
Yes.
the bushfires. But the second raging fire or fires is the outrage of identity politics,
Yes.
or identity conflicts. Despite the fact that we are living in a time whereby people, for the first perhaps time in history, have direct access to difference, direct access and proactive opportunity to engage with the other as they are and as they present themselves. Yet we see a sense of elegy towards the other in our society, despite all the discourses around multiculturalism and whatnot. But the reality is that there is an outrage of identity politics, meaning that we are constantly concerned at the back of our minds with the wrong of the other, the defects of the other, perhaps in religious terms, I'll put this in quotation marks, the misguidance that befalls the other from our point of view. So how do we perhaps become less cynical and more appreciative of others in our society, especially as a religious community? How do we become less sensitive to the weaknesses and defects of others, either within our own religious community or within the broader human society?
Well, I think this brings us to maybe an uncomfortable topic, and it's the dreaded N word, which is narcissism. And I don't mean narcissism as a diagnosis, a severe disorder of personality, but I mean narcissism as existing in all of us to some degree.
Sure.
And the narcissism that's in each and every one of us causes us to become tribal and dogmatic and to look at the world through the lens of good versus bad, love versus hate, superior versus inferior. And most people in times gone by naturally grew out of that narcissism when they would get an education, they would get married, they would be members of society. But I think what's happening in our society now is that this narcissistic sense of injury and perhaps I'm either injured and I'm defective and wounded and you need to recompensate me, or I'm better than you, has become weaponized and politicized amongst our youth on university campuses, where you're seeing a generation growing up with these, as we could say, chips on their shoulders, that perhaps you didn't see as much in older generations who, to use a cliche, got on with life. We're busy raising families, because basically once you marry, do the things that we're told today are boring or perhaps too conservative, it doesn't leave much time for all this identity politics in the real world. And that marks the split today between the common and everyday man and woman, and a segment of society, including the intellectual elites in academia and many of our youngsters who have been influenced by them, who have become infected with this mental contagion of identity politics. So I think we all have it within us. It's an element of narcissism, but the milieu today is encouraging young adults to carry through this narcissism, perhaps into middle age and beyond. So we're not having the same developmental trajectory that perhaps adults in even just previous decades had, where they would outgrow this.
Absolutely, and especially in the age of social media, where everybody pretty much talks.
Right.
And so even words have become so cheap that we use them, misuse them, and abuse them all the time in the name of the truth and in the name of values and ideals.
Yes.
But I guess it all comes down to the attitude we have to the truth, the attitude we have to engaging with the other. Is it a right attitude, or is it a pathological attitude? And perhaps because we are overly engulfed and overwhelmed with our own worlds, that we don't tend to feel or be conscious of our attitudes to these issues and to these patterns of behavior that we instantly engage with on a daily basis.
Yes, and we're not getting the corrective feedback. We're being encouraged to have these attitudes of exclusion, of
dogmatism.
I think dogmatism, but I think one of the biggest issues is resentment.
Sure.
The sense that I didn't have my fair share, or I didn't get my what was rightfully mine, and you have it. And that can descend into a form of pathological envy in people, which then seeks them to destroy the other or dispossess the other of what they have. And this is when this narcissism becomes pathological. It goes beyond any garden variety, infantile sort of issues that we may all have, and it becomes destructive in the world. And we see this with this movement of trolling people, shutting people up, getting professionals deregistered if they dare to pose legitimate questions. There's this mob mentality that's overtaken, which has created great division in our society, where we have a silent majority and a very noisy minority who occupy the platforms.
Absolutely, and as they say, if physical violence strikes the body, symbolic violence strikes the soul.
Absolutely.
And so this is an example of symbolic violence we are witnessing, unfortunately, today. So I would like to thank you, Dr. Saad, for your participation in highlighting the notion of self-compassion, as well as how to become more curious and self-reflective, and so more preoccupied with developing our own souls, as opposed to searching for the snakes between the flowers, as they say, and trying to track and trace the defects of other people. I think this is an important introduction to understanding the complexity of this topic, in hope that we can create a new culture, a culture of self-reflection, a culture of acceptance, and we'll get to the notion of generosity in our second section. So if you permit me, we would move on to the second participation in our first part. Before we do so, let us listen to a beautiful recitation of the Holy Quran by Sheikh Mohamed Dehnavi.
Thank you, Muhammad.
الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا عليكم أنفسكم لا يضركم من ضل إذا اهتديتم إلى الله مرجعكم جميعا فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, dear brothers and sisters. Once again, thank you for joining us. We now come to the notion of divine mercy in the Holy Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in chapter number 6, verse number 12, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, قُلْ لِمَنْ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ قُلْ لِلَّهِ كَتَبَ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ الرَّحْمَةِ. Say, to whom belongs everything that is in the heavens and on earth, say God, He decreed Himself to be merciful to all. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. When I reflected on this passage in the Quran, the first thing that came to mind was an audacious Jewish tradition in history that says when God was about to create Adam, the ministering angels were divided into contending groups. One group said, let him be created. Others said, let him not be created. And so it is written in the Psalms, truth and mercy collided, peace and righteousness clashed. Mercy said, let him be created because he will do merciful deeds.
Mm-hmm.
But truth said, let him not be created, for he will be full of falsehood. Righteousness said, let him be created, for he will do righteous deeds. But peace said, let him not be created, for he will not cease to debate and cause corruption. Upon hearing this, what did the Holy One, blessed be He, do? As narrated in the story, He took truth and threw it to the ground. The angel said, Sovereign of the universe, peace and blessings be upon you. Why do you do this to your own seal, truth? He says, truth shall arise from the ground. And thus it is written in the Psalms, let truth spring up from the earth. My dear brothers and sisters, Dr. Saad, this story is very telling in the fact that it reveals to us how humans kill when they believe they possess the absolute truth. And so God takes the truth and throws it to the earth to teach us a lesson that in order for life to be livable, the truth cannot be in its heavenly form, complete, total, eternal, Platonic. But rather, we need to develop humility by developing a standard of truth that enables us to become conscious of our limitations, which takes us back to your first point about being curious and self-reflective and focusing on our self-transformation. And so the divine light, as beautifully portrayed in this story, is infinite. But for it to be visible to us, it must be refracted through the finite understanding of the human being. And what really stands out in this whole story of the human being and the creation of the human drama is mercy. Why did God create mercy? And more than that, why did God reserve 99 mercies for the day of reckoning, while sending down only one of His 100 mercies to the earth? I think this question raises the concept of salvation. Is salvation inclusive, even to those beyond our worldview, outside of our tradition? Or is salvation exclusive to the followers of a particular worldview?
Yeah.
And so on and so forth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says He decreed mercy for Himself, meaning that mercy isn't just an action of God, an attribute of God. Mercy is the essence of God, the essence of divinity. And so it's beautiful to to realize that the notion of mercy is on multiple occasions occurring and repeated in relation to the Day of Judgment. So whenever God mentions the Day of Judgment and the Day of Reckoning, there is always a mentioning of mercy in the absolute sense of the word. Mercy that is unconditioned, meaning that mercy not limited to a particular faith or particular faithful community, but mercy in the absolute context of divinity. And here I would like to share with you how mercy, rahmah, which comes from the threefold root, the ra, the ha and the mim, is mentioned in 340 positions in the Quran. Almost equivalent to the number of days across the year, as if God is trying to tell us that every day you need to struggle and strive to exercise at least one form of mercy in your life. But more than that, there are 32 derivatives and morphologies of mercy in the text of the Quran. Let me share with you some examples. Rahima, he showed mercy. Rahimnahum, we had mercy for them in the plural sense of the word. Tarhamuni, you have mercy to me. Sayarhamuhum, he will have mercy towards them. Turhamun, you, group of people, will be shown mercy. Rahma, mercy, as a noun abstract. Ar-Rahimin, those with merciful hearts. Ar-Rahman, the ever merciful. Ar-Rahim, the most merciful. Al-Marhama, the drama of mercy. Al-Arham, merciful kinship relationships. And so on and so forth. Doesn't this perhaps redefine to us our image of God? Doesn't this remind us that our conception of God is so limited that we are unable to see the very mercy of God in its absolute and in its boundless, infinite realm that encompasses the entire creation? I'll finish off with a story to contextualize this concept. And it tells the story of a spiritual master by the name of Abu Mansur in the Islamic civilization, who passed away at the age of 70. And so his son saw him in his dream. He said, Ya Abati, O my father, how was your first encounter with God after departing this world? And so Abu Mansur has a dialogue with his son in the dream. He says, which reminds us of the Jungian school of depth psychology here. So he says, O my son, I encountered the master of the worlds, and I felt the burden of the moral responsibility in front of him. And so he asked me, and we'll finish off with this, what have you brought to me, O Abu Mansur? I made you live in this world for 70 years. He said, O God, I distributed my 40,000 dirhams on the path of charity. God said, I did not accept them from you. He said, O God, I fasted for 60 years. God said, I did not accept this from you. He said, I prayed for 60 years. I went for Hajj. He said, I did not accept them from you. Abu Mansur was overwhelmed, this existential anxiety, saying, O my Lord, then I perish. All of a sudden, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to Abu Mansur saying, Ya Abu Mansur, udkhul al-Jannah. O Abu Mansur, rush to the gates of paradise. Do you remember when you removed the hurl, a stone, from the path of people in your village to protect them? I will grant you paradise by virtue of this humane action you did, which you thought to be insignificant. Isn't this the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at its best? without further ado, we'll go for a 5-minute break and then return to our second part, inshallah.
Searched for the words to describe your beauty. No matter how I tried, no words seemed worthy. Struggled to find the right words for you. Words just fail to describe what's deep inside. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Zemi asaman, जिन्न इंसान की तेरी तारीफें करते बयां साही बेखुद हुए दोनों जहां ही रुख से निकले जब ये कलिमा सुब्हानल्लाह walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Dar havay to پر می گشایم به امیدی که روزی سوی تو آیم. در وصف تو جمله ها را گشتم، کلمه ای نجستم جز این که گویم سبحانالله walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Kuman shari kata puji, moga menjadi zikir hati. Namun tiada kalam yang pasti yang sesuci kalam ini. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar. Subhanallah, walhamdulillah, la ilaha illallah, wallahu akbar.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, dear brothers and sisters. Thank you once again for joining us. We come to the concluding part of our session for tonight with our respected clinical psychologist, Dr. Abdul Saad. Welcome once again, Dr.
Thank you,
Saad.
Muhammad.
Thank you for joining us from Vital Mind Psychology. Let me introduce to you the Quranic sign for our discussion now. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-An'am, verse number 160, من جاء بالحسنة فله عشر أمثالها ومن جاء بالسيئة فلا يجزى إلا مثلها وهم لا يظلمون. Whoever brings a good deed, he shall have 10 like it, and whoever brings an evil deed, he shall be recompensated only with the like of it, and they shall not be dealt with unjustly. Dr. Saad, before we delve into the topic of generosity and the topic of celebrating people's achievements and recognizing their good work in our society, would you like to share your thoughts on the notion of mercy?
Yes, thank you for your very excellent presentation and summation of those points. I just wanted to say that mercy, the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you illustrated this beautifully, it's a reflection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ultimate sovereignty and the capacity of God Almighty to, and I'm using these words figuratively because God doesn't have a mind, but from our perspective, to hold in mind counterbalancing or opposing forces. For example, the need for justice, but also the need for forgiveness. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the infinite, in the infinitude of expression, there must be mercy. And we can apply that to our lives, because if we are to extend mercy, we need to overcome these internal dichotomies and polarities, because there's a part of us that wants revenge. And there's another part of us that says, well, maybe we can be merciful. So mercy requires a level of integration of all of these various competing parts within us, so that we can achieve a level of internal surplus and extend grace to the others in our life. So if we are non-integrated, if we are not in alignment with the principle of Tawheed, mercy is impossible. Because the competing factions within us, the lower, more primal aspects will win over, which are vengeance, retribution, punishment, revenge, right? So mercy requires, grace and generosity requires an integration. And this is why psychologically people that are wounded and haven't worked on their wounding, childhood wounds, ostracism, shaming, resentments, it's very difficult for them to extend grace and mercy to others, because they are living internal contradictions. They are living with these different self states that are in opposition to each other. Does that make sense?
Does that mean that we become fatalistic in the Freudian context, as in the first 5 years of our childhood will determine the trajectory of our life?
I wouldn't say so. It means that if there's wounding there that we haven't dealt with, it develops into scar tissue, and we develop adaptations, and these adaptations are never looked at. They're never really integrated. So we're living in a non-integrated way. So we may be able to say the words of sympathy and the words of kindness, but we may not feel empathy. And there may be someone who actually feels deep empathy, but doesn't have the words of sympathy, and we judge them as non-empathetic or non-gracious or non-generous. Whereas in fact, they are generous, but they may have more difficulty expressing it. Whereas we may be surrounded by wolves in sheep's clothing who are very expressive, but are disconnected from the feeling. So this is where it's the lack of integration,
which cultivates tendencies of being pretentious.
Narcissistic, self-deceiving, and all of us have levels of self-deception in our ego structure. That's part of I mean, I know as Muslims we don't use the word fallen, but it is part of the egoic nature of our disconnection from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because we are not God and the world is not God, hence the disconnection.
Sure. And which goes to show us that the reality of our mission in life is an open-ended struggle with the self, as opposed with changing the world.
Yes.
As Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi used to say, in the past I was intelligent, I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, I want to change myself.
That's right, because as Muslims we do not believe in a purely terrestrial view of reality, a horizontal reality. Reality also has a vertical axis, so we shun utopianism, and this is where I see many young Muslims being seduced by, for example, socialistic tendencies, or they're against capitalism, and I think that is worthy and morally lofty, but what they don't realize is both socialism and capitalism are rooted in materialism. It's rooted in the fact that we are basically machines, and if we more fairly organize the distribution of resources on earth, we can create heaven on earth. And that has always ended in tears and tyranny.
Absolutely.
It is a pipe dream.
Absolutely, absolutely, and very well said. Perhaps this reminds us of the totalitarian so-called Islamist movements,
Right.
which share this ideological utopian dream.
There's a pan-Arabism and
absolutely, with other ideological groups.
Right, yes.
Which
we
does
don't
not
need to name.
Absolutely, yeah. So pretty much we are inflicted with this disease,
Yes.
and it goes to show you that even with this attitude, when we submit God, we are submitting God to our ego.
Yeah.
In return.
Right.
And so I would like now to move into the crux of our theme for our final part tonight, which is generosity.
No.
Let me ask you, Dr. Saad, what is generosity and why is generosity important?
Generosity can be defined in a number of ways. The way that I would look at it is that we live and relate to others with a sense of abundance, with a sense of surplus. Because we realize that all bounty comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that we don't live in a world where it's a zero-sum game. Whereas when the ego takes over, when it is that narcissistic world of with me or against me, then it is zero-sum game. If I give it, in other words, everything becomes transactional. If you gain something, I lose something. Or if I give you something, I'm attached to the outcome of my giving you something, and I'm holding you to account when you don't even know that you've entered into a contract with me. I've, on the face of it, been generous, but I'm keeping score now. Has Muhammad acknowledged my gift? Or, did he invite me? Did he do this? And you don't even know. You thought, I gave you a free gift. So generosity means living within a state of abundance that cannot come if we are materialists, where it's all about possessing things, or it's about achievement and constant progress in a material sense. It is to give freely without any attachment to a human or terrestrial outcome. And I tell people, if you're attached to an outcome, it's better not to give at all. Because what you're giving poisons you and the other, because you are then energetically attached to the giving.
Sure.
It's not a free gift.
Sure.
So surplus and abundance that comes from the divine, from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I like how you are dissecting the multi-layers of human nature.
Yeah.
It's not as simplistic as giving or not giving.
Yes.
There are very complex dynamics behind even apparently good acts that we do. You remind me of Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist, who was a master at dissecting the contradictory layers of human nature. And so my second question to you is, if generosity is often described as feeling gratitude within yourself, but also expressing it, just like a gift, you wrap it, but if you don't give it, it has no value.
Yes.
So how do we practically implement and actualize our inner sense of gratitude in the form of reaching out to people we love? So for example, as simple as purchasing a gift for your mother on Mother's Day, and not being preoccupied whether Mother's Day in the West is Islamically sound or not, but looking for the value. How do we make this transition into a world of generosity that is actionable in our everyday life?
Well, in the spirit of Tawheed, we come back to the original point because it's all interlinked, and it comes back to curiosity. What does this person need? What does this person value? And what I've been struck by as a psychotherapist is that people often need things from us that are not very readily apprehended by the mind. We think we know what they need, but we don't. So for example, for many people, what they need are heartfelt words of affirmation. Not just I love you or thank you, but tell me why you love me. Tell me exactly what is it that I do for you that you value. Showing them that they are consequential. So generosity means that we are curious about others. We want to extend grace, and we want to freely give others what they need. What does this person need? Do they need a word of reassurance because they're in doubt? Do they need a word of affirmation? Do they need to be accepted and given the space to be? And this is something I teach parents. I draw a triangle and say these are three core needs of all humans: to be affirmed, to be reassured, and to be accepted. So I think to be curious and to rise beyond giving someone material, but witnessing someone's humanity and saying, this is what you need, and I'm going to give it to you as a free gift, without any expectation, without any need for brownie points. And all of us have an inbuilt sincerity detector, and when someone is attuned to us at that level, it touches our hearts.
Sure.
We are touched. Sure. And that person is, we warm to that person. That person has a level of charisma and care because they are attuned, because they truly care. Unfortunately, a lot of our relationships today have devolved into business transactions, tokenism, gift giving, where really the heart isn't in it, and people are starving for that heart connection.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because as if people are pretty much trapped in that cycle of being concerned about having a share in whatever they do.
Yes.
And not being able to look at things in the grand scheme of the universe.
Yes.
And so, the fact that God, La ilaha illahu, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is unconditionally generous, even to those who willfully and willingly disbelieve in Him and choose not to believe in Him, is teaching us a lesson that we need to adopt that stance of hospitality without expecting any return.
Yeah, because God's bounties are never exhausted. His treasures are never exhausted. And on a practical note, if there's someone listening tonight that says, well, you know what Abdul's talking about, it's too lofty or it's hard.
Cheap optimism.
Right. I would say, well, practically, this is the value of psychotherapy.
Yeah.
This is the value of good quality psychotherapy or coaching or whatever modality, where you work on healing your inner child.
Sure.
You work on healing your wounds. You work on bringing into light your resentments, your envies, your jealousies. This is what good psychotherapy is about.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
Because that will heal these blocks. And also, not just psychotherapy, but feeling included as part of a community to the listeners, to the viewers. Because we suffer today from a sense of being excluded, especially in our Muslim community. It does not cater for the wide variety of intellects and temperaments. It's very narrow, and people feel disenfranchised. And what I tell people is, look for groups beyond the community. It doesn't mean that you are giving up on Islam, but your local geographic community in Sydney, in Melbourne, and wherever in Iran may not have what you need socially at this moment. So you need to look beyond the frontiers of your geographic community so that you can heal your wounded social instinct, feel included, and then come back to your community a whole person that can make a contribution.
Absolutely, which reminds us of a fact in neuroscience today that giving is receiving.
Yes.
The very sense of spiritual and emotional flow that we feel in our souls upon sincerely giving is in itself the reward.
Yes, it's therapeutic.
It's very therapeutic,
healing,
absolutely. And so we come to the conclusion of tonight's session with Dr. Abdul Saad, clinical psychologist. I would like to thank you for, giving your time and effort and knowledge.
Thank you for the invitation.
To our community and our viewers. Without further ado, please don't forget to subscribe on our YouTube channel titled Enlightened Thought. Share your questions, share your comments. Please tell us about your definition of generosity and tell us about how perhaps we need to revisit the notion and the image of God in our own perceptions in light of divine mercy. Inshallah, we'll see you tomorrow night. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.